The neural basis of syntax. We're going to focus on the cerebral cortex. We'll start with a brief history of syntax and brain. Going way back in the 1870s, a grammatism in production was characterized, a grammatical production disorder, which Kussmaul described as an inability to grammatically form words and to order them syntactically in the sentence. 1914, Karl Kleist provided some more specification of the nature of expressive agrammatism. He said, the basic trait of agrammatism is the simplification and coarsening of word sequences. Complicated compound sentences, subordination of clauses are not built. The patients only speak in small, primitive mini-sentences, if they continue to create sentences at all. All less necessary words, especially pronouns and particles, are reduced or eliminated. Also in 1914, he described a second type of grammatical production disorder, paragrammatism. In paragrammatism, he wrote, the ability to create word orders is not abolished, but phrases and sentences are often wrongly chosen and thereby amalgamate and contaminate each other. Phrases and sentence constructions are not completed. The spoken expression is not simplified overall, instead also conditioned by a strong overproduction of word sequences. It swells to confused sentence monsters.
Hi Byron, how are you?
I'm happy.
Here's an example.
You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talked with the people for them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
Juneau.
store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. It would happen. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. I'm very happy with them.
Good.
This girl was fairly good and happy. And I play golf and hit other trees. We play out with the hands. We save a lot of hands on hold for us, other hands. I don't know what you get, but I talk with a lot of hand for him. Sometime. Am I talk of any more to say?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I hope the world lasts for you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
So here are some examples from Butterworth and Howard from people with paragrammatism. And I want everything to be so talk. She was handled to look at the books a bit. I'm very want it. Isn't look very dear. Is it? But it's silly, aren't they? So those are the sentence monsters that Kleist referred to. Now, the next major milestone in the history of syntax and brain came in the 1970s when my former PhD advisor Edgar Zurif and Alfonso Caramazza clearly described the condition of agrammatic comprehension, which is characterized by difficulty comprehending syntactically complex sentences, which co-occurs with expressive agrammatism. It's also typical of Broca's aphasia. Now, the co-occurrence of expressive and receptive syntactic difficulties suggests a general syntactic deficit. The fact that it occurred typically in Broca's aphasia implicated Broca's area, and put those two bits together, and you get the conclusion that syntax lives in Broca's area. If they had a time machine and could fast forward to 2015, they would have realized that the association between Broca's aphasia and Broca's area damage isn't so strong for other reasons as well, but here is a recent observation that chronic Broca's aphasia involves damage not only to Broca's area, but to Wernicke's area. Other work suggests that you don't even need damage to Broca's area. Nonetheless, the point is that the association is not entirely clear, linking Broca's aphasia to Broca's area. Back to the story. Having discovered that agrammatic comprehension exists, the field almost exclusively focused on receptive syntax. probably because it's just much easier to study than expressive. Focus on receptive syntax because it's more easy to study than production. And that continues to today. The next major observation came in 1983 with Marcia Linebarger, Myrna Schwartz, and Ellie Safran, observing that people with agrammatic comprehension, or so-called agrammatic aphasics in their terms, can nonetheless perform reliable grammaticality judgments. They have sensitivity to syntactic structure, which isn't predicted if there was a general deficit, which of course changed the term in the formula that we presented earlier, in the sense that it is not, according to this work, a general syntactic deficit, which changes the conclusion that it is not the case that syntax lives in Broca's area. Shortly after that work was presented was the invasion of the functional brain scanners, and that came in the mid-'80s and continued in earnest over the course of the '90s with functional MRI. One of the early studies, if not the earliest, on sentence syntactic comprehension was a PET study by Karen Stromswald et al. And they contrasted in this now old-fashioned looking image center-embedded sentences minus right branching sentences, the lone activation in the pars opercularis, square in the middle of Broca's area in the left hemisphere. Their title was Localization of Syntactic Comprehension by Positron Emission Tomography, and this was a mic drop moment at the time. How did this affect the formula that we've been kind of developing here? It was functional imaging, so it squashed any consideration of any of the lesion considerations. Now, it turns out that this result is fairly consistent. There have been many replications. Not every study finds it, but enough that if you do a meta-analysis on the term sentence comprehension, you will find robust activation in Broca's area. And there were many claims with respect to what Broca's area is doing, all focusing on all of the sentence language-related claims having to do with a syntactic role for Broca's area. So a syntactic specialization for Broca's area as the common denominator in the cortical network for syntax. A specific claim, hierarchical syntactic structures must be constructed from sequential input. That's just a fact. These computations are supported by Broca's areas, and that is the conclusion that these authors reached. Hierarchical artificial grammar involves Broca's area. You get the idea. In the last decade, there have been several new lesion studies that started picking up steam and a energized interest in lesion studies of syntactic comprehension, but as well as production. And here's, they tell a modality-dependent story. Here is a summary of, or a representative pair of studies, one by Wilson et al. Looking at production and agrammatic production in particular, showing the involvement of frontal areas, whereas comprehension, syntactic comprehension, involves posterior temporal areas, including agrammatic comprehension. So if you just map the lesions associated with that people with agrammatic comprehension have, this is the distribution of lesions that you typically find. Now, this work suggested that there is a role for Broca's area in syntax, but it's more leaning towards the production side than the receptive side, which is not inconsistent with the fMRI data, because fMRI data not only shows involvement of Broca's area in sentence comprehension, including syntactic manipulations, but so too is the posterior STS and MTG consistently showing these effects as well. So both of these regions tend to show these syntactic effects. So to summarize these observations, Broca's area is implicated in fMRI for receptive syntax and expressive syntax, but not for receptive syntax in lesion studies. It is only implicated in expressive agrammatism. We're going to come back to other aspects, paragrammatism in particular, in a bit. The posterior STS/MTG is implicated again in fMRI in receptive syntax and expressive syntax, which I didn't talk much about, and also strongly implicated in lesion studies of receptive syntax. Now, this asymmetry is inconsistent with the typical assumptions in the field. That is, that most, or perhaps even all models that I'm aware of, assume an amodal syntactic system doing, and you can insert your favorite syntactic operation, merge, or whatever your favorite is. It's doing that for both production and comprehension. But we see this asymmetry in the involvement of posterior and anterior regions in according to whether it's a receptive or expressive task. For this reason, William Machen, a former student of mine and now collaborator, developed a new model of the cortical organization of syntax. I'm going to talk to you about that now. The starting point is the observation of this comprehension-production asymmetry, which exists at the word level and is predicted by dual-stream models, and it's empirically supported. So to take an old-fashioned but pretty accurate dual-stream model, this is Wernicke's model. Comprehension involves only one side, what we would call today the ventral stream, and here's some data showing word comprehension, lesions associated with deficits in word comprehension, whereas production involves the entire network, and here's some data from a picture naming mapping study showing involvement of lots of different areas, including dorsal stream regions and ventral stream regions. Now, this asymmetry is naturally explained by sensory motor control architectures. So, for example, in this architecture, this is motor planning at two different hierarchical levels, and that motor planning is going to make use of sensory targets as part of the process. So you involve the entire network, including motor and sensory systems at multiple levels. In comprehension, incoming input doesn't need to make reference to motor plans. This is fairly well established and can manage quite well without these dorsal motor systems. So this is predicted quite straightforwardly from motor control models. And the question we want to consider here is this is a model that seems quite reasonable at the phonological level, but we are looking at the higher level. So the next level up is not split into a sensory and motor kind of architecture. And the question is, are these higher levels of the system also couched in a sensory motor control architecture? So we're going to zoom in on this part of the model and ask whether this kind of architecture makes sense. Now, the first thing to notice is that we're talking about a word level here, or in psycholinguistic terms, the term lemma is often used. And traditionally, this involves not only lexical and abstract word representation, but syntactic information as well. And this is also consistent with lexical-based grammars, which put a lot of the syntactic work into the lexicon as opposed to a separate formal syntactic system. So that's the first observation. The second thing we might wonder is, where are we talking about? If we're splitting off a component, where is that thing going to live? Well, we just talked about the posterior MTG region as being a candidate for this word level receptive component. Now, what is it actually doing? Well, Grushinsky and Frederici in the earlier quote told us what it should be doing. That is, hierarchical syntactic structures must be constructed from sequential input. That is, you get sequential input coming in at the phonological level as you're listening to a sentence, and you've got to generate a hierarchical syntactic structure. They thought that this was due to operations of Broca's area, 44 and 45, but what we're entertaining here is that this operation might be carried out in the posterior MTG. So the idea is that speech input comes in and it provides the linear sequence. So you don't have to compute or derive a linear sequence. It's given to you for free by the talker. At the next level, you access the lemmas, which come with little bits of syntax, and you put those together to generate a hierarchy. And from that point, you can then map that onto a compositional semantic meaning. Going in the reverse direction, you have start with a concept of some event involving some players in the event, and from there you want to access the lemmas associated with the entities in the concept as well as the action that's being generated. Those things come with little bits of syntax, which are then combined to produce a hierarchy. But this does not give you the sequencing for free anymore, because you're having to generate it rather than getting it from the talker. And so the sequence has to be computed. And the idea is that this other component of the network is the thing that's doing the linear sequencing of the morphemes or lemmas. So the idea is that this component of the network is doing morphosyntactic sequencing. Incidentally, this can be used as a high-level working memory crutch for sentence processing during receptive syntax. So the idea is if you're presented with a complex sentence and you need more time or resources to process it, you could recode it in terms of a sequence and use that, rerun that, say it back to yourself, and use that input to derive the hierarchical lexical syntactic structure and the conceptual meaning. So this could be used as a kind of syntactic working memory, which is something that has been proposed previously. So where is this morphosyntactic sequencing system? Our best guess is that it's in the pars triangularis. These lower level pars opercularis regions seem to be doing something more at the phonological level, and the pars triangularis is what gets implicated more directly in sentence production. In terms of the white matter connectivity, our best guess is that this connection is mediated by the outer arcuate fasciculus, whereas the inner arcuate fasciculus corresponds more to the phonological level connection. So the neurology of syntax is the following then, according to this view. The syntax is broken up into a couple different parts. So yes, there is a network of regions involved in syntax, as many people have proposed, but different components of syntax involve different regions, which are interconnected with each other. And the architecture of this system follows a high-level sensory, that is temporal lobe, and motor, that is frontal-related architecture. So that the different components of syntax follow this architecture and adhere to the same sorts of principles involved in motor control in terms of their recruitment and asymmetry during perception and production. So to just walk through these ideas, so this component here is involved in linear sequencing. When you damage it, you get agrammatism because you're no longer able to generate the sequences that correspond to the hierarchical representations that need to be sequenced. Sentence comprehension deficits are minimal, but maybe since this region can be used as a working memory crutch, there may be some relatively minor deficits under very high load conditions. And it affects, for that reason, it affects predominantly expressive syntax. Damage here affects the hierarchical processes involved in syntax. When damaged, produces paragrammatism because it is no longer possible to take semantic event structures and derive a hierarchical relationship between them. What the patient is left doing is just selecting pre-coded sequence chunks, maybe highly familiar sentence sequences, morphological sequences, and kind of glomming them together. Damage here also produces a severe sentence comprehension deficit because you can't map from the linear sequence at the phonological level to the combinatorial nonlinear event structure. And it affects both receptive syntax because you can't get from the linear sequence to the event structures, and you can't get from the conceptual meaning while you into the linear sequence because you don't have the mediating hierarchical representation. Now this view makes a prediction that agrammatism should be associated with lesions here and paragrammatism should be associated with lesions here. There is evidence for this from cortical stimulation mapping, but few people have studied the lesion correlates. In fact, no one that we are aware of has studied the lesion correlates of paragrammatism. So we tested this after developing this model and recently published a report showing exactly this. So this is just two different ways of analyzing the same data, regressing out lesion volume only and regressing out lesion volume and controlling for fluency. So agrammatism does indeed map to frontal areas, paragrammatism maps to posterior temporal regions. The center of mass of this focus here is a little more dorsal than we might have predicted, and that's something that we'll have to follow up. Maybe that's an interesting novel observation. So to summarize, this is basically a generalized sensory motor architecture for language. So the phonological level system is split into an auditory phonological component and an articulatory phonological component. And so too at the lexical syntactic level, there is a hierarchical lexical syntactic component and a linear morphosyntactic component. And the regions involved are color-coded here. And then this is just my attempt at a Van Essen style circuit diagram for language, taking all of this information into account and cross-referencing motor control terminology for these things and psycholinguistic terminology while throwing in a little bit of musical terminology as well. The whole point of trying to integrate motor control architectures with psycholinguistic ideas and so on is that we can integrate different approaches to these fields. And this is an attempt to do that. Thank you very much.